When Scott Steiner appeared at the Survivor Series, the atmosphere was electric. It was 2002 and WWE was starting to sign up all of the biggest former WCW wrestlers. There were 17,000 fans on hand inside Madison Square Garden when the sirens started to sound. Matt Hardy and Chris Nowinski were in the ring before they were interrupted. Steiner destroyed both men, clotheslining and suplexing them out of their boots. But of course, this wasn't the first time that Steiner had appeared in WWE. He'd wrestled for the WWF as part of a tag team with his brother back in the early 90s. The Steiner brothers were one of the mid-90s most fearsome tag teams as they made a name for themselves across WCW, ECW and over in Japan. Their hard-hitting wrestling style gained them millions of fans and made them notorious backstage among the other wrestlers. Scott and Rick were both decorated amateurs and were both named NCAA All-Americans in their career before becoming pro wrestlers. When the Steiner brothers came to the WWF in 1993, there was high hopes that they'd give some credibility to the Federation's terrible tag team division. And while they did win the tag team titles twice, they were a shadow of the team that they'd been in WCW in Japan. Their wings were clipped by Vince McMahon, who was trying to market the product directly towards kids at the time, and a violent, smash-mouth tag team like the Steiner brothers didn't really fit that vision. And so they left the WWF after just over a year, but it's interesting to note that Scott was being considered for a main event push even back then. Both Pat Patterson and producer Bruce Pritchard were impressed by Scott's look and athletic ability. The men were struggling to come up with a suitable main event for WrestleMania 9 at the time, and they thought that taking a chance on Steiner could solve that problem. So they suggested to Vince McMahon that Steiner should win the 1993 Royal Rumble and go on to the main event of WrestleMania 9. McMahon eventually vetoed the idea, and Scott himself wasn't really into it either, saying that he would rather stay in the tag team with his brother. But it's interesting to think what could have been if they'd gone down that route. But in the end, they went back to WCW for the greatest run of their careers. They became 7-time WCW Tag Team Champions, and they were so entertaining during this period. Unlike in the WWF, they were allowed to wrestle that violent style that suited them best. But eventually, Eric Bischoff decided to split the tag team up because he saw more promise in them as singles wrestlers, and Scott came out of the split really well as he joined the NWO in February 1998. He adopted not one but 3 new nicknames: Big Papa Pump, the Genetic Freak, and the Big Bad Booty Daddy. He became an ultra alpha male. Honestly, he could have been a totally different wrestler. Scott had paid his dues in wrestling, and now should have been the time for him to ascend to the main event level. However, in 1999, WCW's glass ceiling meant that no new main eventers were being produced, so he ended up getting stuck in the mid-card. That was until mid-2000 when he was finally elevated and he became the World Heavyweight Champion. He was one of the best heels the wrestling business had ever seen, and he brought a sense of credibility to the WCW World title that hadn't been seen in years. He was a fell-mouthed, angry and violent heel, and he was really good at playing that character, and the fans had difficulty working out whether Steiner was just good at playing his character or if he was genuinely unhinged, and truth be told, some of his peers in the locker room had a hard time working it out too. During that final year of WCW's life, Steiner was a force of nature as he tore through the likes of Kevin Nash, Goldberg, Booker T and Sid Vicious. Steiner should have been the World Heavyweight Champion 2 years earlier, because by the time he got there, the company was already a sinking ship, so everyone hoped that Vince McMahon was going to use him well in WWE. It was announced on an episode of Confidential that the genetic freak had signed a contract with the company, and in that video package they did a great job of reminding everyone why he was such a big deal. On TV, Raw General Manager Eric Bischoff and SmackDown General Manager Stephanie McMahon competed to get Steiner to sign for their brand. Stephanie tried to secure Steiner's services by suggesting that she might become one of his so-called freaks, while Eric presented Big Papa Pump with a bunch of strippers backstage. WWE were putting Steiner over as a megastar, and they were also allowing him to inhabit almost the exact same persona as he did in WCW. When he first appeared in front of the live crowd, they popped big time for him. He was so over with the fans. They knew exactly who he was, and he was presented like a big deal, at least to begin with. In the end, Steiner chose to accept Bischoff's offer and join the Raw brand. And this is where things started to go off the rails for the big bad Booty Daddy. Triple H was the #1 heel on Raw, and he was well into his reign of terror as the World Heavyweight Champion at the time, as he was booked to beat everyone who was put in front of him. And while it was hoped that Steiner could be the one to finally put him in his place, most of us knew deep down that that was never going to happen. Steiner told Triple H that he wasn't there to start at the bottom, he was there to beat him for the World Heavyweight title. Steiner's promo was actually very good, and in the short term at least, he came across like a legit badass. But the problem was, he was playing the good guy. The babyface role wasn't one that felt natural to his character, and every babyface that was placed in front of Triple H up until this point was just there as cannon fodder. And in the long term, Steiner was never going to come out of this feud on top. From here, what they should have done was have Steiner live up to his reputation as a psychopath. They should have shown video packages of him going on the rampage during the final months of WCW. They should have had him ploughing through jobbers every week, 2 at a time, while Triple H watched on in fear. He could have trashed Triple H's locker room, and he could have even kidnapped Ric Flair. Imagine the sight of Steiner putting Ric Flair in a body bag and dragging him behind him. You could have had Steiner making Eric Bischoff his personal bitch, and he could have even invaded SmackDown. Imagine him just showing up on SmackDown, destroying Jamie Noble or someone, and then just speeding off in his Dodge Ram or whatever car he drove at the time. Steiner should have been presented as an unhinged nutcase that took the business into his own hands, but we didn't get any of that. Instead, what we got was an arm wrestling match, a pose down, and a bench press competition. They reduced Steiner's character down to just being a musclehead, and the story became about who had the biggest biceps out of him and Triple H. The air was let out of the feud almost immediately, and it was boring to watch. As they headed into their match at the Royal Rumble, all of the mystique surrounding Steiner was completely gone, and there was another problem too. Steiner was suffering from an injury called drop foot syndrome. This was a condition that made him less mobile in the ring than he'd been before, and of course Triple H insisted that their match at the Royal Rumble was nearly 20 minutes long. If you were watching back then, you'll remember how utterly tedious Triple H's matches were at the time. Even against the most agile opponents, his matches just methodically plodded along. Steiner should have been nowhere near a 17-minute match in 2003, whether he had a problem with his foot or not, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't have been in the match at all. Vince McMahon knew how to book big, immobile men in main events if he really wanted to. He'd been doing it since the days of Andre the Giant, and frustratingly, the match ended in a disqualification. Triple H retained his title after using the sledgehammer. The match went on to win the Wrestling Observer's Award for the worst wrestling match of the year. Incredibly, the feud dragged on for another month as a rematch was booked for No Way Out in February. And in the interim, they wasted no time making Steiner look even weaker as he was beaten down by the members of Evolution. The match at No Way Out was better. I mean, a bra and panties match would have been better than what we saw at the Royal Rumble, and at least they kept it short at just over 10 minutes. And naturally, Triple H pinned Steiner to retain the title. And that was the end of the feud, and it was also the end of Steiner's main event run. He didn't even appear the month after at WrestleMania 19. For the rest of his WWE career, he slid down to the mid-card where he teamed up and feuded with Test. His last appearance in the company was in the 2004 Royal Rumble, where he lasted 6 minutes before being eliminated by Booker T. WWE released him from his contract in August of that year while he was injured. After his time in the company, Steiner had surgery to repair his foot, which allowed him to perform longer, more athletic matches. So when he appeared in TNA, they gave him the opportunity to work on his own terms, and he had a very entertaining run in the company. Steiner's reintroduction to WWE at the end of 2002 was handled brilliantly. From that excellent video package on Confidential, through to his electric appearance at the Survivor Series, right through to Eric Bischoff and Stephanie McMahon vying for his services. But in the end, he had to fall victim to Triple H, just like so many others at the time.